Hey guys, so now I'm calling from my dining room because it was freezing outside, and I realized that I did a not very good job with the whole Russian Revolution thing. It's a huge deal, and I want to go back and redo it. So disregard what I said about the other about the 1905 revolution. I want to go a little more in depth. So bear with me here. Once again, I am going to be doing. I kind of redid my lecture here because I realized that the Russian Revolution is a huge deal. Some of you in class, like Evan and Colin, might be a little bit disappointed that I didn't go into it too much. So I want to redo this and redeem myself with a better one. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in Russia, because as you guys know, what's going to happen in Russia is going to be huge when it becomes the Soviet Union during World War One. So let's give a little bit of background here, because the wheels start really turning during this age of anxiety. So first of all, um, let's talk a bit about this industrialism. Remember, like I said, the Crimean War really exposes how backwards the Russian industrialization had been, how far behind they were everybody else. So some people started to try to tackle this problem. And we start to see, though, that this is going to bring, of course, industrialization is going to bring in socialism, right? Because you got a new working class, and do you want to say hi? You got a new working class. You got the same problems that industrialism brought to England and Germany and France and everything else. Well, now they're happening in Russia just a few decades later. We've also got a new czar, Nicholas II. And Nicholas II has his flaws. He's very similar to Louis XVI of France in that sense, also a king during a revolution. Just getting text messages here. So let's talk a little bit about this revolution of 1905. It's going to come with the defeat of the Russo-Japanese War, and it's going to result in a general strike that will lead to something called the October Manifesto. But let me go into a little bit more detail here. This is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be redoing it. So what Russia was like before World War One? Well, like I said, they really needed to modernize and they needed to industrialize. But the obstacles in the way are the fact that Russia is huge. It's behind socially. I mean, they only just ended feudalism. So how are they supposed to catch up to England and Germany and all this and the rest of the world when they have been so far behind this whole time? And how are they going to do that while also avoiding socialism and Marxism? They can't. So industry is going to bring new levels of poverty. With it, you're going to get some socialism and Marxism. So the Minister of Finance at the time, who worked for Tsar Louis, look at what I did there, Tsar Nicholas II, they're so similar, is this guy named Sergei Vit. Sergei Vit is the new Minister of Finance for Russia, and he starts to push for industrialization. He even builds a railroad. He wants to build a Trans-Siberian Railroad, and he does it. It just takes a really long time to complete it because so much of Siberia is buried under snow for so much of the year. So, but he's seen as the guy who really brings the beginnings of industrialization to Russia. He's not very popular with some of the more old-fashioned and traditional aristocrats of Russia. Some people don't trust him. So anyway, the new working class of Russia, because of course this is going to happen, right? What do you expect? You build a factory in Russia, the workers are poor. They are, of course, now going to veer towards socialist thought because it's not like they're being treated well. So this new working class does exactly what is expected. And then the Russian government, being very oppressive, forces them underground. It makes their activities illegal. So these socialists are forced to go underground. When you are forced to go underground because your ideas are illegal, by default, that makes you a revolutionary. Because now just having the ideas that you're having and spreading them around, the fact that they're illegal, this now makes you a revolutionary. And it also makes them more radical, right? It makes them more determined to change things. It was so bad that the Marxist Social Democratic Party of Russia is actually forced to operate in exile because they get kicked out of the country. And they're operating in exile from Brussels in Belgium and then later on in London. And now they're not just asking for, reforms. They're actually wanting now to overthrow the czar. So you see what happens, right? The difference between what happens in places like Germany and Britain, where we see that socialists are existing within the system and trying to cooperate within the system of the government, as opposed to Russia, where they are not allowed to even exist. So they automatically become revolutionaries and want to now overthrow the whole system, which, as you guys know, is what's going to happen. So here's a picture of our guys. This is our Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty. He was the last Tsar that Russia would ever have. There's his Minister of Finance, Sergei Vit. A little bit about Nicholas II. So this is Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra. So Alexandra is actually the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. And that means that she is related. She's first cousins with so much of European royalty because Victoria had so many kids. So she's actually the first cousin of King George of England. She's also the first cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. By default, that makes Nicholas also their cousin. So all of European royalty is really one big dysfunctional family. They are friendly with each other, of course, but then World War I is going to break out, and this is a huge family feud. The other thing about Nicholas and Alexandra is that they are one of those rare royal couples that actually genuinely loved each other, even though it was an arranged marriage. Alexandra is actually originally from Germany, and she was a Lutheran, but she converts to the Russian Orthodox Church for him. And obviously, their children are raised in Russia as well, and they're raised as Russian Orthodox Christians. As you can see, with 5 children, they obviously loved each other very much. They had 4 daughters, Olga, Marie, Tatiana, and the very young Anastasia. That's the Anastasia from, the legend, Anastasia, the cartoon movie that was made about her, which is not true. It's just a legend. And then they had a 5th child. The youngest was the heir to the throne. His name is Alexei. Alexei, though, is born with a genetic condition called hemophilia, which is a medical condition in which your blood doesn't clot, so you can actually bleed to death from a simple cut or bruise. And hemophilia, by the way, is a disease that is prominent amongst people who are inbred. As you guys know, like European royalty often was responsible for a lot of inbreeding. The other thing about hemophilia is that women can carry it, but it doesn't manifest in them. Only men can be actual hemophiliacs. Women are not afflicted by it. They can carry it though. And so what we know is that Alexandra, the Tsarina, gave it to her son, Alexei, and that's why the 4 daughters didn't have it. Well, as you can imagine, he's the only heir to the throne of Russia. So growing up as a little boy, he doesn't have a normal childhood. He's not allowed to run and play and jump, and he's susceptible to injuries. They're very protective of him. And so the royal family of Russia, the Romanovs, live in constant fear that something terrible will happen to Alexei. More on that later. Okay, so what about Russia before World War I? So, like I said, they are defeated by Japan in something called the Russo-Japanese War. This was in 1904 to 1905. Russia and Japan were fighting over Korea. They both had invaded Korea, or at least had attempted to. They both want Korea as part of their own empires because Korea is a bunch of ice-free ports. It's a large peninsula. It has ice-free ports. And so they both want Korea because Russia especially has so many ports that are not in use during so much of the year because they are, in the winter, they're just icy. So, and Japan wants Korea because they see Asia as its rightful domain. So Russia and Japan go to war. And everyone is expecting Russia to win because, Russia is humongous. They're like 30 times the size of Japan, at least. And also, there's racist thought at this time. Russia is deemed to be a European country, and Japan is not. And so, therefore, it's deemed by European mentality at this time as inferior just because it's not European. Even though Russia's not, the majority of Russia is actually in Asia, but because of Russification, Russia considered itself to be a white country, at least its government did. And they tried to impose this sort of white Russian culture on everyone. So the Russians finally lose to Japan at Port Arthur in China. This defeat is especially humiliating because it also, once again, exposes how backwards Russia's industry was. Why Russia lost? They just had, more primitive weapons. Their soldiers were more exhausted. In order to get a bullet from St. Petersburg or Moscow, where all the factories munitions factories were, all the way to Port Arthur in China, which is where much of the war was taking place, was near Korea, you had to ship the bullets by train, right? And not just the bullets, but all the munitions, all the food, all the supplies, Even the soldiers themselves had to be shipped by train across all of Russia, this massive country. But the railroad station wasn't even complete. So they would at times have to disembark from the train, take dog sleds, or walk or march or something across until they got to the next completed section of railroad. And that sometimes happened 2 or 3 times. So you can imagine how ridiculous and how long it took. And when soldiers ran out of bullets, just to get them more bullets took forever. So they were vastly underprepared for this war. And the Japanese had already modernized. Japan was already an industrialized country, because in the 1840s, when America basically shows up in Tokyo Bay and says, hey, you guys better let us in and trade or else we're going to take over, the Japanese actually willingly invite Americans in, but then also learn from them. So the Japanese motto here is, if you can't beat them, join them. So Japan becomes, in every respect, an industrialized, modernized country in a very short amount of time. And they're very efficient at it. So this war causes political upheaval. On the same time, you've got some middle-class liberals in Russia. There's not that many of them, but enough to cause a commotion. And these middle-class liberals, the bourgeoisie of Russia, they want some liberal political reforms, like they want a constitution, they want a legislative body, just like what we see in France 100 years before, right? Also, Russia has a lot of ethnic nationalities. Only 25% of Russia is considered to be in Europe. And then on the other side of the Ural Mountains, you've got Asia. So Russia is actually very ethnically diverse. So there's a lot of racial discrimination. So it's kind of the same problem we see in Austria. At the same time, Russia is incredibly poor. The peasants have very little land, and the laborers work in absolute misery, to the point where sometimes some of the factory workers had to live in the factories where they worked because they had no homes. So this all comes to a head on January 9th, 1905. It's a day known as Bloody Sunday in Russia's history. And on this day, the workers of the factories of St. Petersburg had had enough. And so they appeal to a priest. His name is Father Gapon. He's a Russian Orthodox priest. And he has the workers sign a petition that is basically asking for just better conditions. Here she is again, our resident TikTok celebrity. And this petition is presented they're trying to present the petition to the Tsar himself. So they go to the Winter Palace, which is his palace in St. Petersburg. It's the one, it's one of the ones that was built by Peter the Great, if you remember. So, do you mind? No. So anyway, they get there, and the Tsar is nowhere to be found. He's not dealing with these protesters today because the legend has it is, hold on 1 second. The legend is that the Tsar was busy with his son. His son apparently had started bleeding from some sort of injury, and he was preoccupied with that. So the Tsar tells his officers to just deal with it. And in turn, the officers decide to deal with it by turning their guns on the unarmed protesters, petitioners, really. They weren't even protesters. They were just there to present a petition. This huge crowd included women and children, and they were completely unarmed because they hadn't gone there to attack the Tsar. They had gone there to give him a petition. And the troops end up killing 500 unarmed people. I think she wants to show you guys Izzy. There's my dog Izzy and my daughter Iris. Okay, so this killing, can you please? Okay, so this shooting of these unarmed protesters or petitioners actually leads to massive outrage. The Tsar is now incredibly unpopular. People have lost their faith in him. They no longer feel that they can turn to him as a fatherly figure. And so the peasants themselves are starting to view the Tsar as just a villain in this story. So there's peasant riots, the Zemstos that, these are the local authorities. They start to demand a parliamentary government like the one England has. There's even a general strike, and factories all over Russia just shut down because of this general strike. And Nicholas really, he's not good at leading. His father had ruled with an iron fist and was known for getting the job done. He was known for being incredibly authoritarian and scary. Remember, his father was Alex III. Alex III was the son of Alex II, the Tsar that got blown up after he freed the serfs. And so in turn, Alex III becomes incredibly strict and cruel. Nicholas was more of a marshmallow, and he kind of wavered back and forth between wanting to be loved and wanting to be feared, but he didn't quite have that Machiavellian balance down. So he was instead seen as just incompetent sometimes, poor guy. So anyway, these are images of Bloody Sunday. These are the one on the left is an actual photograph taken by a journalist, and as you guys can see, in the front here are the Tsar's troops, his officers, and over there are the protesters. But notice it's January in Russia. The ground is covered in snow. So you can imagine what the snow-covered grounds in front of the Tsar's palace looked like after the shooting was over, covered in red blood. This was not a good moment for the Tsar. So he has to now do a little bit of damage control. And he does this by responding with something called the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto was Nicholas's way of trying to sort of make amends for what had happened on Bloody Sunday, but his heart's not in it. He doesn't really mean it. The October Manifesto essentially says that he is going to now grant civil liberties to the people of Russia, and he also gives them what they want. He establishes what's called the Duma. The Duma is the legislative body of the Russian government. It's basically like what the National Assembly is to France or Parliament is to England. He's now saying that Russia is now a constitutional monarchy, so to speak. Maybe not really constitutional, but it's definitely not absolutist anymore. So this satisfies the middle class in Russia. The middle class feel that they now have gained something, right? They have the Duma, which is what they wanted. So the middle class bourgeoisie are fine, are happy with it, but the peasants end up gaining nothing. Does this sound familiar to you? Because it sounds like what happened in France, right? The peasants don't gain anything. But it doesn't really matter anyway. The Duma can't do anything because Nicholas is going to do whatever he wants anyway. Essentially, the Duma was just something that existed in name only, and they could debate all day if they wanted to. At the end of the day, Nicholas had total authority and would do whatever he wanted. But the guy that was put in charge of the Duma was this guy. His name is Alexander Kerensky. Remember his name, guys. We're going to hear about him again later with the Russian Revolution. This is Alexander Kerensky. Okay, he's a liberal lawyer and revolutionary. Does he sound familiar? Because it's kind of the same resume that Maximilian Robespierre had. Although he's not going to go crazy with a guillotine or anything like that. Essentially, the revolution is going to fail. This first 1905 revolution is a failure because while they do get the Duma, it's just symbolic. It doesn't really do anything. And at the end of the day, the Tsar is still sort of seen as this incompetent figure. There's no real constitutional monarchy. Then Nicholas ends up actually hiring this new advisor, a chief advisor. His name is Peter Stolypin. And Peter Stolypin actually decides he's going to try to make some real changes. He's going to try to give the peasants some land, and he wants to try to instill real reforms to bring real improvement and try to quell some of the rioting and some of the discontent in the country. And then he gets assassinated in a theater during an opera performance. It was very dramatic. He gets assassinated by a conservative in almost like literally in the same room that the Tsar was in. So after Stolypin gets murdered, the Tsar starts to crack down even more. Even though it was a conservative that murdered him, he blames the assassination instead on the radicals and the liberals. And he sees this as an excuse now to really crack down and start to use the secret police even more. So this is where we are at just before World War I. A lot of this revolutionary activity will be put on hold once the war breaks out because people are going to rally to the cause to defend their country against the German attackers. But the war is going to go very badly, and so the opportunity for revolution is going to present itself when Russia essentially runs out of food and bullets. And this is where we're going to see the Great Russian Revolution that will lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to stop it there because it looks like my...
Bye.
Can I say bye? I'm going to stop it there because it looks like...
Bye, class.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Yeah. See you guys next time. Anyway, I hope that this kind of helps. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Okay, drop some comments, email me. You guys know what to do. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.
Bye. Peace.